This is Arab Talk on KPOO 89.5 FM in San Francisco. This is Arab Talk with Jess and Jamal. I'm Jess Ghannam.
And I'm Jamal Dajani.
Jamal, we have quite a show. Lots to talk about today, very international. You know, one of the things that we haven't been able to really check in on have been the Olympics, the delayed Olympics in Japan, obviously. And nothing escapes the reach of the Hasbaristas, I should say, and, the influence of the apartheid state of Israel. And you've done a really incredible interview, and we're going to hear later from May Shigenobu, who is a journalist and is going to be speaking about her experience with the Tokyo Olympics, what's going on, holding events, the COVID-19 issue, and I didn't even know this, so I'm be very interested to hear what comes up with that, the decision to commemorate the 1972 Munich Olympics. So there's a lot to talk about. After that, there's actually quite a bit going on still. There were some judokas who, judo athletes from Algeria and Sudan who decided to boycott the Israeli Olympians. We're going to do a follow-up with Ben and Jerry's, obviously. They published a really interesting op-ed in the New York Times. We'll talk about how even Israeli academics are supporting the Ben and Jerry boycott. And finally, Jamal, I'm going to really be interested in your ideas about this. Since you've been to Tunisia after the first Arab Spring, are we headed for another revolution in Tunisia? So lots to talk about today.
That's right, Jess. We're going to start with May Shigenobu. I've been to Japan. So I don't claim to be an expert on Japanese politics. You and we don't claim to be experts, and that's why we have the right expert for you to this topic. Let's watch and listen to May. In February, a survey found that 80% of Japanese people do not want Tokyo Games to go ahead. On Tuesday, Japan's prime minister said there were no plans to shut down the ongoing Olympic Games after a record number of new COVID-19 cases were recorded in the country's capital. Joining us to discuss this and more, May Shigenobu. May is a Palestinian-Japanese journalist. She also has a doctorate in media studies from Doshisha University in Kyoto, Japan, doing research on the development of Arabic media. Welcome to Arab Talk, May.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
So in late June, in an unusual public statement, Japanese Emperor Naruhito disclosed his deep concerns about the coronavirus spread during the Tokyo Olympics. Yet despite the rise of COVID cases, it looks like the government and its prime minister want this to go on. Why? Is this a political maneuver to avoid a major economic disaster?
I think there are a few things here. One of them is this is a way for Japan to show the world or try to show the world that it is over the Fukushima nuclear disaster. Like the Olympics it held in 1964, which was a sign that Japan has overcome the war and the disaster of the war. This time it was kind of a signal to the world that Japan is now, fully recovered and, welcoming tourists. And also it was like a way to boost the economy, the Japanese economy, even though eventually this whole thing is a complete loss for the government, because it doesn't have all the revenue, the expected revenue that's going to have from tourism and from the legacy effect, which is, in the coming 10 years from the people who come to Tokyo for this Olympics will start to tell others to join and go and visit Tokyo. So this is always expected from the Olympics, the legacy effect. So Tokyo has lost both the actual tourists for the Olympics, the sales of the goods for the Olympics, the hotels, all the reservations, plus all the ticket sales and the possible, tourists that were supposed to come in the coming 10 years because of this Olympics. So it was a way of marketing for Japan, especially that we have a very extreme right-wing government right now in Japan, which is very much concerned about, making this Japan as a great image in the global community.
So yeah, that's actually, I didn't know that that's kind of the right government. It's more of a nationalistic government than the usual ones. And then there is something interesting that I don't know if it was reported on Japanese media, but I know in the Middle East media, and you're very well aware of that. Historically, the Japanese public and government have supported the struggle of the Palestinian people. Yet, this was in 49 years that the opening of the Olympics seems to be politicized, focusing, for example, on the 1972 Munich Olympics when Israeli Olympic team members were killed by Palestinian gunmen at a time when Palestinian children keep getting slaughtered by Israeli occupation soldiers and settlers. What's up with Japan allowing this to happen, and were there any motives behind it?
Yes, there is a bit of a story behind all this. Again, I mentioned that we have a very right-wing nationalistic government right now in Japan. But on top of this, since we had the oil embargo in the 70s, Japan had actually changed its way. It was completely with the American foreign policy supporting Israel up until then. But after the oil embargo, Japan had been hit very hard economically because it relies completely for imports of the oil and petroleum from the Middle East. So when the oil was, this was an Arab way of the OPEC or the OAPEC, if you want, way of trying to, punish all these countries that were supporting Israel when the Six-Day War happened in 73. So when you have this, Japan here shifted from being completely pro-US foreign policy in supporting Israel in the Middle East. It shifted towards having better relations with the Arab world. However, this time, it's been a while since Japan was trying to maintain this quote-unquote neutral relation with the Arab world as well as relations with Israel. But now we have in the government, the Vice Minister of Defense is someone who is quite fond of Israel. He's visited Israel several times. He is someone, for example, when you had the recent Gaza massacre, Palestinians were being massacred. At this time, what he tweeted was our heart is with Israel. Wow. Yes. And in another interview, he spoke that the most fear for Japan right now, for Japan's defense, the biggest fear for Japan right now is fake news, Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Red Army. So if you
sounds like Donald Trump.
Yes, and it sounds like Hamas and Hezbollah. Where did that come from for Japan? I mean, it's not like so. He is like completely immersed in the Israeli defensive mindset. So this guy is also even though he's an official, he's a vice minister of defense. When I don't know if you've heard, there was a scandal in the team, the IOC, the Japan Olympic team, and there was a certain person, Mr. Kobayashi, who turned out to be someone who had made jokes about in a comedy skit in 1998. This is way back in 1998.
Oh yes, and he had to quit, resign.
Yes,
yeah.
Yes. He made a joke. Previously, it seems he had made a joke about the Holocaust. Now, I think most people didn't know about this, or maybe people didn't remember or anything, but someone had come out with this information. And this Vice Defense Minister, Mr. Nakayama, the first thing he did was not going to the Japanese government to complain about this positioning and this person who might be, a problem for relations between Japan and Israel. He went straight to the Simon
Wiesenthal
Center to tell them that we have this certain person who is the responsible person for the opening ceremony, the director of the opening ceremony. He has had a history of talking about the Holocaust in a derogative way. So you would expect to have this person first complain to the Japanese government, but not to the center, So this is the level of this person's attachment to Israel and the Israeli government. So from here, you have this, what you just mentioned in the beginning. In the opening ceremony, you had a memorial for the Israeli athletes that were killed 79 years ago. And this is the first Olympics where they have this minute of silence for these athletes.
49 years ago.
Yes, 49 years ago. Yes. Yeah. So it was in 1972, I think, the Olympics of 1972 in Munich. So, okay, there is no problem in, commemorating any victim of any, if they're athletes and, they want to commemorate, but this was prepared. I mean, like, you had families of some of the family members attending the opening ceremony. It's a completely prepared kind of show of solidarity with Israel. And I think this is also a part of this right-wing kind of collaboration or, showing alliance with Israel in a way.
So this was a way to basically, because of what this vice minister has done many years ago, a way to kind of push Japan into that commemoration. Because, I mean, I find it very strange, like I said, at a time when the world is shunning Israel. Israel has been declared an apartheid state by Human Rights Watch, by its own human rights organization, B'Tselem, also declared it an apartheid state. Today, there is a big ad in the Haaretz newspaper, or yesterday was a big ad in the Haaretz newspaper. 100 politicians and academics, etc., saying, like about the story of Ben and Jerry's. We've been talking about this, that they actually thanked Ben and Jerry's for boycotting Israeli settlements, that Japan did something 49 years old. I mean, frankly, if anyone who needs to be commemorated these days, the millions who have died because of COVID. I mean, that's a legitimate, not to kind of rehash something in the past, and then at a time when Israel is murdering Palestinians. That's why I'm bringing this up. It's just the timing and the venue being in Japan seemed very abnormal for such an event to take place.
Indeed, I agree. If there are people we need to commemorate, and I have no problem with commemorating people's loss and everything, but there are a lot of people we could commemorate at this kind of event, as you mentioned, the COVID victims, the medical staff who sacrificed their lives all this past year and a half for this fighting this pandemic. You have Hiroshima's victims. You have all sorts of victims that you could, remember in this kind of event in Japan.
Absolutely. I mean, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I mean, what's more important than this for the country? I just want to add on this topic a couple of things, because you may not know, but the Simon Wiesenthal Center, and I've written about this many years ago. They are behind the destruction of Palestinian cemeteries in Jerusalem. It's a very historical cemetery called Mamella, and that's where my great-grandparents are buried, in the Mamella cemetery. And they built on it a museum. They call it a museum of remembrance. I've written about this many years ago, and they've complained. At the time I was writing for the Huffington Post, and the Huffington Post editorial team contacted me, and I said, no, that's what they're doing. They're removing. I mean, if this was done anywhere else to any, Jews or anywhere else, to remove ancestors and stack them up in boxes just to build a museum, the world would be up in arms. So they're, I mean, they should look at their history of what they have been doing in destroying Palestinian, history and cemeteries in Jerusalem.
Indeed, I agree. It's like giving a present to Israel at a time when the world is kind of starting to open its eyes about Israel's apartheid system, its discrimination, its occupation, its massacres of Palestinians. So it's a time to try and, pressure Israel to come to its senses, not a time to, give presents to Israel left, right, and center with all these behaviors, even before the Olympics. But one thing that might come to mind, in my opinion, this could also be a kind of apology for having this, Olympic committee member that was, known to have previously joked about the Holocaust. So maybe it's a way of trying to correct that. So they're doing this.
So they threw the Palestinians under the bus.
Yes,
right?
Yes, could be. I can't be sure about this. I don't know what's going on behind the scenes. If this was all planned before knowing this fact, or it was planned after, this fact had come out to the public. But there has been a history of this, as I mentioned earlier, this strong ties with Israel for this government, and actually from 2014, Japan has strengthened its ties with Israel quite strongly this time.
So far, there have been a couple of boycotts that I know of at the Olympics of Israeli athletes.
Yes.
Algerian judoka Fathi Nourine and his coach Ammar Ben Khalaf had their Olympic accreditation withdrawn on Saturday, and they were sent home, or I think they were sent home, after refusing to fight an Israeli athlete. A second judoka scheduled to face an Israeli athlete has dropped out of the Tokyo Olympics, Sudan's Mohammed Abdel Rasool, who weighed in but did not show up for the match. How's this been covered in Japan and in the Arab world?
In the Arab world, I've seen it, yes, both news, I've seen it, but of course, the Tunisian, the Algerian athletes' news was bigger because it was the first athlete boycotting on the spot his fight, and this could have been his fame, but he chose, to sacrifice this position for his what he believes in. But in the Japanese media, it hasn't really. I mean, maybe in the local media it might have been mentioned, of course, when they're giving daily coverage about judo and all this, but it's not a big news. Another thing that I noticed actually just yesterday was that there is another news that hasn't been even in the English media. It's been in the Arabic media, but it hasn't been in the English media, and only the BDS of Japan has brought it up, which is that one of the athletes in the Palestinian team has also, he's born in Jerusalem, but when he was introduced in the opening ceremony, he was introduced as an Israeli, he's born in East Jerusalem, but he was introduced as born in Israel. Mm-hmm. So the Palestinian Olympic Committee's head, Jibril Rajoub, had complained about this, and he even threatened that the Palestinian team will withdraw from the Olympics if they do not correct it. And immediately the IOC did apologize for this mistake. But according to what the Japanese BDS says, it's not corrected still on the website. So it was a lip service as as an apology, but it has not been changed on the website or the system as yet. I don't know. Maybe after we talk, this has changed, but as of yet, this was the situation.
Yeah, this is very important. Thank you actually for bringing this up. And I noticed also some media networks are having a problem, especially getting their feed when the Palestinian team, when every country had at least they introduced them as Palestine.
Yes.
That's I give them credit. They didn't say West Bank, Palestinian territories, but they had a problem with the map.
Yes.
So they had this weird rectangular whatever map, which didn't even represent the West Bank, didn't represent Gaza. People didn't know if they only put Gaza, didn't represent historic Palestine, just like a sliver of it's like it's inaccurate. And people raised some complaints, but now nobody's talking about it.
Yeah, that was, I think, was it NBC, was it? Or which, I forgot which channel. It was
NBC in the US is the main network that's bringing, but that's what I saw it. You're absolutely right. So I don't know if it happened on other networks.
Yes. Actually, that's also shameful, I think. This is the least where you have to do your homework and know how to prepare for how to introduce the teams, unless if it is intentional. Like I'm sometimes doubting what the IOC, the way it introduced this Palestinian athlete, is, I might think it's not maybe a pure mistake. It's another service to Israel by mentioning that Jerusalem, East Jerusalem, is part of Israel.
Another bit of news, which is a happy news, Tunisian swimmer Ahmed Ayoub Hafnawi was the stunning winner of the 400-meter freestyle at the Tokyo Games on Sunday, beating a field of faster and more experienced and older swimmers. How was this received in Tunisia? Because I know you monitor the Arab world. And did it also stun the Japanese public?
It did, actually. Even in Japan, it was surprised because he was ranked in the 300s or something in the world ranks. So a person who was completely unexpected to win won the gold medal. So this is why it was also in Japan quite a stunning result. And it was also covered, of course, in the Arab media and also the social media. It was all over the place. Happy news for everyone, of course. But also the Western, like The Guardian, also even titled it as a shocking gold medal for the Tunisian swimmer.
May Shigenobu, thank you for coming on Arab Talk.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, that's the voice and the sound of May Shigenobu. I know I mispronounced her name. I'm so sorry, May. A really kind of extremely in-depth, very comprehensive analysis, Jamal, that we're probably not hearing a whole lot about, even in the mainstream media, which is covering the Olympics. What's interesting to me about Japan, Japan has been a big player in Palestine, in terms of their commitment to rebuilding and supporting and just politically over the years. So her analysis on the Munich Olympics commemoration was very interesting.
Absolutely, Jess. And of course, she lays it all out there as far as the history of Japan and Palestine, because it has changed several times. How governments pre-70s, I would say, pre the oil embargo, basically and blindly followed the policies of the United States vis-a-vis Palestine and Israel. And then this has changed then when they realized that they had to develop relations with the Arabs and Palestinians. But now what she's saying is that there is a new far right-wing government that has shifted its policies in support of Israel and expanding their bilateral relationship,
right?
Which, by the way, ended up in throwing Palestinians under the bus. That's what happened during these Olympics, and this is the issue. And many people don't talk about this, Jess, is the issue that here you have the Olympics, right, happening. They're happening in what we can definitely say very, very unusual times.
Right.
Millions of people across the globe have died because of COVID, and it's been 49 years since the 72 Munich Olympics. They shift the attention to the commemorating the athletes that were killed in 1972 without an explanation, by the way, because previous countries and the Olympic committees refused to do that. They didn't want to mingle politics with a happy opening.
Exactly.
However, this has a background, which I didn't know. I had to read about it. And then, of course, May had to explain it to us. And this goes because there was an MC who was going to be talking about the Olympics, a Japanese MC who's also a comedian. He made fun about the Holocaust 20-some years ago.
Right.
And then a vice minister of the Japan of this government in Japan reported him to the Simon Wiesenthal. Like, didn't report him actually to the Japanese government.
Right.
They reported to Simon Wiesenthal, and so the Simon Wiesenthal put the pressure, in addition to Israel and probably the United States, put the pressure on the Japanese government to shame them first. The guy was forced to resign, which he resigned, okay. But then somehow the commemoration got inserted in the opening ceremony, which usually is seen by millions and millions at a time of people, at a time when we've been talking on the show. Israel has been massacring Palestinian children, ethnically cleansing entire families from Sheikh Jarrah, Silwan, etc. And the world is shunning Israel because of its apartheid status, starting with the Human Rights Watch and so on.
Well, that's exactly right, Jamal. That's why, this is yet another example of, and we're going to talk about this later in the show too, the level of anxiety and distress that the apartheid regime of Israel is experiencing right now. I mean, we talked about this last week in terms of how they were, to use your term, which I think is great, they melted with rage at the Ben & Jerry's boycott of occupied Palestine. This thing with the Olympics is especially painful, I think, for especially most of us, and especially for Japanese living in Japan, because they're commemorating something that happened in 1972, introducing politics, when in fact, so many Japanese are dying right now from the COVID-19 pandemic, from the Delta variant. I mean, what you're not hearing about in the opening ceremony is the health crisis that's occurring in Japan right now. Really a catastrophic one, Jamal, that, it's got one of the lowest vaccination rates in the world right now. And the Delta variant in Japan is on track to really cause and wreak havoc on the Japanese community. But none of that is discussed, articulated. And but yet we have to talk about the Munich 72 Olympics. So I think it's more of a reflection of the desperation of the apartheid regime right now, because, as you say, they're getting confronted on all fronts in terms of their apartheid practices, their ethnic cleansing. Maybe to make the transition now really quickly. We'll talk about Ben & Jerry in their op-ed in the New York Times, but what about the Algerian and the Sudanese judo players who boycotted Israel? I didn't see any big media description of that. That's kind of a big deal.
It is a big deal, but I want to just go back to something that May said, and one is also the Japanese themselves, because you mentioned COVID, they have demonstrated, including the emperor.
Right.
They were against holding the Olympics in Tokyo.
That's right.
Then the other thing is we've mentioned COVID, which would be justifiable to kind of commemorate the lives lost during the past year. And so, but also, Japan, suffered probably one of the biggest catastrophes, the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Exactly.
That was not discussed. So not to discuss, COVID, the death from COVID, the death from the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and then kind of bypass that and go to something that happened 49 years ago that other committees, you can see the politics at play in this. But you're correct as far as what's happening. There have been statements, and a second judoka has pulled out of the Olympics competition, and because he was matched to an Israeli athlete, Tohar Betbul, the name of the Israeli athlete, and he's the second one to pull out from the Olympics. Before him last week, Abdul Rasul from Algeria refused to basically participate in this, and then he and his coach were sent home. They withdrew and they were sent home. The interesting thing about the Sudan thing, Jess, which I found like Algeria, I know that Algerian positions, you and I talk about that, and every single Palestinian knows that. Historically, they are not 100% behind the Palestinians. They're 200% behind the Palestinians, right? You see that in all their games, soccer.
Right.
And because there are a lot of similarities.
Right.
Algeria suffered under French settler colonialism for 200 years, almost 200 years, and they understand what Palestinians are going through. So they are unequivocally supportive of the Palestinian cause. But Sudan, in January, signed into the so-called Abraham Accords, the invention of your friend Donald Trump and Jared Kushner.
Right.
That's right. Basically paving the way for that country to normalize ties with Israel. Then later that month, Sudan said that it was disappointed. You didn't hear that much about the news. Not only that's the government, but that's the kind of, they're disappointed of the outcome of the normalization agreement. And the agreement itself was widely protested in Sudan. So the athlete, the judoka who withdrew, is just like really, I guess, following the steps of the public and the sentiment of the public by refusing to normalize.
That's right.
But relations with Israel.
Exactly, Jamal. That's exactly right. But let's keep in mind the signing of the Abraham Accords with the new leadership in Sudan. Just to remind our viewers and our listeners what was behind that. Sudan was on the terrorist watch list, had economic sanctions against it, and basically what Trump, Kushner, and the American influence said, if you want any kind of economic stability in your country, after we supported the revolution that happened and the bringing into power of the new government, you're going to have to sign these Abraham Accords. The Abraham Accords ended up being a disaster for the Sudanese community, for the general population. It did nothing for them except, normalize, so-called relations. And you're exactly right, Jamal. Every Sudanese individual I've ever spoken to, and I've been to Sudan, I could tell you the average Sudanese in the street will tell you unequivocally that the Abraham Accords is a joke and they don't support it. So if you want to look at where Sudan really is, look at this judoka who pulled out of the Olympics, which arguably was probably one of the most important things this athlete could have done in their career. So let's not kid ourselves about the Abraham Accords. And by the way, the other signers of the Abraham Accords, Jamal, have been equally lukewarm since Donald Trump and Jared Kushner have left the scene. So I'm ready to say that the Abraham Accords are dead. I don't know how you feel about that, but...
Well, I mean, they're dead because the way they were presented and now how they shifted. They were presented, including statements by the UAE government saying they're doing it as a favor to the Palestinians because they're going to stop the settlement movement etc., and so on.
Right.
And we know what's going on. As we are speaking, ethnic cleansing continues in Palestine. So that's a slap in their face, because if that's how they presented it, I don't care about the economical relations or this petrodollar tourism that they want to have between Israel and the UAE, because at the end of the day, it's going to be about just basically tourism and the economy, but really nothing else. And we know actually that helped in the or accelerated the spread of corona to both countries.
That's right.
By trying to do that. And again, we can talk about that in details next time. You've been listening to Arab Talk on KPOO San Francisco 89.5 FM.
So Jamal, we should talk about Ben and Jerry, right? Because we spoke about this last week. They were attacked viciously by the Hasbaristas. They were called terrorist ice cream. They're being boycotted by Israelis because Ben and Jerry decided, their corporate company decided to boycott basically, Israeli colonial settlements in occupied Palestine. Firestorm erupts, Jamal. Ben and Jerry are viciously attacked, and they write a very, I would say, nuanced, op-ed, opinion piece in the New York Times where they say, and I'll just summarize it briefly before we talk, we're proud Jewish Americans. They actually said they support, the state of Israel. Pretty strong statement. But what they said is that our commitment to human rights and values transcends everything. And basically the illegal, apartheid occupation of Palestine can no longer be tolerated. So I would say it was probably, not as strong as maybe you and I would have liked, but they came out swinging against all the haters.
That's right. And I like the title of the opinion piece. We're Ben and Jerry, men of ice cream, men of principle. Right. I actually enjoyed the title. Right. I think it's a very good title. Which, by the way, we will post that editorial, on the screen and also on the website for those who have not read it. Also, you're correct. They said, we're not anti-Israel, we're not anti-Semitic, because they've been labeled as anti-Semitic, even though they're both, the founders, Ben and Jerry's, both are Jewish. They were labeled as anti-Semite and self-hating and whatever. And, they sold the company. They remain on the board in some capacity. So they end one paragraph. They say, while we no longer have an operational control of the company we founded in 1978, we're proud of its action and believe it is on the right side of history. Yeah. And I think that is very important, because you and I talk about all the time about all these people and countries who are on the wrong side of history. All these senators and all these surrogates of Israel, all these people who whitewash its crimes, they are on the wrong side of history. I applaud them because they want to be on the right side of history.
Absolutely, Jamal. Well said. And I will say, it wasn't a perfect opinion piece, but what I will say is that it took a lot of guts. It took a lot of commitment on the part of Ben and Jerry. They have been for 40 plus years, maybe even longer, one of the biggest, progressive capitalists, if you can, because, they started
I have to say there's something bad now. After they've done this, I've increased my consumption of Ben and Jerry's ice cream, which is really bad. I should not be doing this. Well, that's okay, Jamal.
You're making up for all the, moronic Israeli politicians who are posting pictures of them throwing out Ben and Jerry's ice cream. So, you're just making up for their really...
I don't want to. I want to support them.
But listen, the statement for them, they were trying to speak to a middle ground, not really a progressive statement, but a very well thought out, nuanced, middle of the road kind of exploration and analysis of the reasoning behind boycotting Israel and why it's important. So I think historically, Jamal, this is a big moment in the BDS movement. And they do say, by the way, and this, they don't support in general the BDS movement, which I thought was unfortunate. but yet they're engaged in a boycott. So, it's interesting the way they framed it.
And on this topic, Jess, while Israel's Prime Minister Naftali Bennett vowed to act aggressively against the decision by Ben & Jerry's to stop selling its ice cream in the occupied Palestinian land, sub-92 progressive Israelis thanked Ben & Jerry's on Tuesday in a full-page published ad in the Haaretz newspaper.
It's a big deal.
Under the banner, it's another kind of like we're seeing all these editorials. Now it's an ad, and this one had under the banner, "Thank you, Ben and Jerry." The ad stated, "Dear Ben Cohen and Jerry Greenfield," I'm just going to read a little bit. "We're writing to let you know that in Israel there are also other opinions. Thank you for your commitment to Palestinian human rights." So
wow.
I think more than 30 of the signatories included well-known academics, just notably 21 professors from the Hebrew University and from 11 other universities from Tel Aviv, academics from Haifa University, Bar Ilan University, the Weizmann Institute of Science, and Bezalel Academy also added their signatories. So a lot of prestigious names who also want to be on the right side of history. So it's kind of, do you see the kind of the pyramid crumbling, Jess?
Yeah, Jamal, I think that's exactly what I was going to say. Maybe the pyramid is not crumbling as fast as we would hope and like, but I think in this last year, we're seeing movement in the BDS movement and movement confronting the apartheid regime of Israel in a way that we haven't seen, ever. And so slowly but surely, one chip at a time, one statement at a time, one commitment at a time, even one person being on the right side of history at a time is making a difference. And I always go back to the same thing. You can measure how powerful these progressive acts are by the strength of the Hasbara reaction. When you have the president of the apartheid regime, the prime minister, and all of these idiotic members of the Knesset who are throwing out Ben & Jerry ice cream on Twitter and labeling it terrorist ice cream. It's a statement of their desperation more than anything else. And I do believe that they're more desperate now than they've ever been in a very, very long time, Jamal. So, this is time to really celebrate these small wins. It's really a big deal. But listen, we don't have a lot of time yet. And I've been really wanting to ask you this question. Completely off the radar in terms of the mainstream media, you spent a lot of time in Tunisia during this is the birth of the Arab Spring, and arguably one of the few places in the Arab world where the positive outcome of the Arab Spring took over and there were democratic reforms in the Tunisian parliament and government. But some things happened in the last couple of weeks, Jamal. Are we in for another Tunisian revolution?
I don't think so, but of course a lot of things are happening, and you're right. 10 years after the revolution that triggered what now the so-called Arab Spring, Tunisia long regarded as one of the few democratic transition success stories, because everything else, in my opinion, has failed, be it in Syria, Libya, and so forth, right? So
Egypt.
Yeah, Tunisia has a special place in my heart. I spent a lot of time in Tunisia, and I arrived in Tunisia right at the beginning of the revolution, right in January, right after the death of Bouazizi, which kind of triggered everything that went on. I've witnessed the revolution. I've witnessed demonstrations against the first Prime Minister Ghannouchi. I've witnessed the elections there that brought a Nahda party into power. So now what's going on? There is a crisis. The crisis is because the current president, Kais Saied, which, by the way, I've met. I mean, he's actually a bright guy. He's a judge and a lawyer. suspended the parliament and lifted the immunity of politicians for 30 days. And he was citing a provision in Tunisia's 2014 post-revolution constitution. And that, of course, the folks at Al-Nahda party, who are described as some people like to compare them to the Islamic Brotherhood, but they are not. Actually, they're more like a moderate Islamist party.
Right.
So now they're accusing him of saying that Kais Saied is staging another coup. That's what the term you use. They're using that, and this is, of course, Saied, by the way, had a landslide election. He came into power in 2019. And as I said, again, the funny thing, I met Saied. Here's the funny thing. There was a conference about media law and other things.
Right.
And in Hungary, in Budapest, in Hungary. And this is the crazy thing.
And he was there.
He was one of the invitees. So he is a well-known law professor, and he's considered a social conservative. He campaigned as an outsider because at the time he was and he fought against the Tunisia's parliament, with Al-Nahda party, and now, if you take a first glance at what's going on, you'll say to yourself what you've asked the question. How similar is this to the toppling of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt in 2013 with the getting rid of Morsi? Remember?
But that's my question to you, Jamal. Does this smell a little bit like what happened to the Muslim Brotherhood and Morsi in Egypt? Is this a mini version of this? Is this petite? I don't know. I mean, this is just, it seemed
I don't
came out of the blue.
I don't think so. It's yes and no. I mean, if you take a first glance at it, you say, yeah, that's what reminds you of. And again, I was there when Morsi came into power and was elected in Egypt. I covered that both from Cairo and from Aswan. And then we know what, after a year, they just got rid of him, and we know what happened. We've talked about that to Morsi. The poor guy ended up, dead.
Dying in prison.
In prison. I think there's a difference. The difference is that Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, who's the current president of Egypt, at the time when Morsi was president of Egypt, he was the defense minister. In fact, that was kind of, in retrospect, Morsi's mistake. I mean, if you ask Morsi to appoint him as defense minister, he appointed him as his defense minister because he thought Abdel Fattah Sisi was religious enough and he will won't clash with him on the religious ideas. And so what happened in Egypt, Sisi had all the support of the army.
That's right.
When basically he launched his coup, that's what happened. He had the support. 99.9% of the army supported him. Now, Saied is a civilian.
Right.
Morsi is just part and parcel of this whole military establishment of Egypt. How Egypt, in fact, Morsi was again the first civilian president, because every single one, Sisi is not, who went ahead with the coup. Kais Saied in Tunisia, he's a civilian. He's a lawyer. He does not have that connection with the military. He does not have the connection with the security services.
Right.
He's going after a well-organized, and also Nahda. They are far more organized, and they have more supporters in Tunisia versus the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. So I don't know if it's going to be the same. I don't think he's going to be able to pull it.
I know we don't have a lot of time, Jamal. Maybe we'll cover it again next week. But my question to you is, what's up with the timing? Like, why is this happening now? Is the Nahda party getting stronger? Is he feeling more vulnerable? Why is this happening now?
Well, I mean, the issues with the Nahda party has been ongoing for many months.
Okay.
Some people support Al-Nahda, and there is a schism in Tunisia.
Right.
And others want to go to the old times when you had the the progressives. I mean, anytime you mix religion with politics, you're going to have an issue. And some people also who came from outside Tunisian diaspora, who returned to Tunisia, also changed the political system there. Many of them are part of Al-Nahda party. So things have not been, this didn't happen overnight. This has been building up to something like this. But I tell you one thing, I'm working on getting a good colleague from Tunisia once, maybe hopefully for next show or the show after, to talk about the intricate details.
Good. We need that.
To what's going on. Just what I want to say is the Tunisians are bright people. They'll do the right thing as long as, and I say that, they don't allow foreign intervention. And that's what I smell in this. This is my fear.
Yeah.
We've seen this. We've seen the same story happen in Libya and other places. Tunisians have resisted that foreign intervention, and that's why they were successful. They have differences, like everywhere else. Everywhere else they have their differences. As long as they don't allow this foreign intervention, they are going to be okay.
Well, Jamal, I have a much more nefarious interpretation, but it's related to what you just said. I think anytime you have a stable Arab regime, there are forces on the outside who do not like to see stability among Arab countries. And so I had the same thought too. Is this some sort of effort to mildly, if not significantly, destabilize Tunisia, because it's always in the outside interests of countries or other state actors to see a less strong, less stable, less secure Tunisia? That's the thought that I have. It's always the first thought.
Well, you might be on the right path, just, how can we dismiss something like this? Happening in the Middle East. So you could be like 99% correct. We're going to keep an eye on this issue. Hopefully we'll get someone from Tunisia to talk about it on the next show or next. You've been listening to Arab Talk on KPOO San Francisco, 89.5 FM. Go to our website, Arab Talk Radio, to download all our shows there, and we will talk to you next week.
We'll see you next week.